They found Douglas Edwards at dawn, bent over the steering wheel of his old Chevy on the shoulder of Highway 75 outside Omaha. At first glance, it looked like a crash. A smashed windshield, twisted metal, the smell of coolant and gasoline in the cold morning air. But 5 miles down the road, a neighbor remembered seeing a black sedan with a dented bumper turn off toward the interstate at 2:17 a.m. The timing didn't match the official story. For days earlier, Douglas had filed a story that shredded a senator's carefully polished image, a scoop about a deadly night 2 years before that the senator had tried to hush. For those who loved him, the timing wasn't a coincidence. For the police, it was a case that would dim into the long, slow ache of a cold file. For his family and colleagues, it became a crusade. 8 years later, a confession by a tired, broken man in a dimly lit interview room would unlock a chain of lies that led impossibly to the senator's arrest. This is how a cold case solved in Nebraska turned a community inside out. Before we dive deeper, take a second to subscribe to Calis-Crime Vault and smash the like button. It's much appreciated. And keep these stories coming your way. They called him Doug. He arrived at the newsroom with coffee at dawn, hair still damp from the rain, a reporter's notebook tucked into the back pocket of his jeans. He had the habit of staying with the story until the last reluctant witness either told the truth or ran out of excuses. The scoop that would get him killed came from a call 2 weeks before the crash. A shaken voice that said a senator's car had plowed into a young couple on a country road, then sped away. The official explanation: poor weather, an unavoidable tragedy. Doug's sources said otherwise. He found a woman who had seen the taillights disappear, an autopsy report that didn't quite match the police statement, and a ledger entry in a county contractor's book that suggested hush money had been paid to keep quiet. He filed the piece on a Thursday. For days later, on a lonely stretch of highway, his Chevy crossed the guardrail and smashed into an oak. Everyone who loved him knew the truth, but nobody could prove it. The first week after his death was a clouded, raw thing. Reporters who raced to the scene reported the same small details: the angle of the car, the absence of skid marks, the way the seatbelt was buckled that suggested Doug had been handling his wheel when another vehicle hit his back quarter panel, sending him into the tree. Police called it a tragic accident. A local columnist called him reckless. The sheriff's department, tight-lipped, told the public they were keeping all options open, a phrase they used to soothe a curious town. The big story slipped from the front pages as funerals and condolences filled the air. In the newsroom, a laminated photo of Doug stayed tacked to the wall. It was there for everyone to see. A man who loved bad coffee, cigarette ash in his notebooks, and the conviction that the public deserved the truth. Douglas Edwards' sister, Maria, did not accept accident. She had watched Doug grow, argued politics with him at family dinners, and sat through his long calls late into the night, when safety was a secondary concern to exposing wrongdoing. Maria stared at the sheriff, at the vigil, at the press releases, at the final police report that concluded road conditions and actions of the deceased were to blame. She hired a private investigator named Tom Hale, a retired homicide detective who had a low tolerance for sloppy explanations. Tom found things the official investigation skimmed over: paint transfer on Doug's bumper that didn't match his own car, a smear on the road shoulder consistent with a second vehicle's tire, and a witness, a farmhand named Earl, who had been ignored the first time around. Earl's memory was a thread. He had been tending a generator behind a feedlot, wearing earplugs, when a low-slung black car idled near the intersection, then pulled away quickly, heading east. He remembered the car's license plate fragment, the first 2 letters and the last digit, because the man driving had tossed a scrap of paper into a rusting mailbox. Earl remembered a figure getting out, glancing nervously, then returning to his own vehicle. He could not swear to facial recognition, but his description matched other small observations: a bruise on the driver's knuckle from a steering wheel, a flattened cigarette, but a deep-seated smell of motor oil. These details were tiny, but to Tom they sang like a choir. He put them together and realized the official file had not pursued the possibility of a staged crash. In 1982, the tools for solving crimes were different. There was no easy DNA database to ping when new evidence emerged. Forensics existed but was not the be-all. Investigating meant knocking on doors, collecting receipts, and finding people with patience to tell their memory stories. Tom and Maria began a quiet campaign. Interviews with bar owners who remembered a nervous man offering hush money, county clerks who found late-night payments, and a contractor's ledger with an entry that matched the date of a car repair. They assembled a paper chain. The ledger named a local towing business that had, on a certain night, repaired the kind of damage Doug's car sustained. The same towing business served some prominent clients, and one of them was, as one invoice hinted, the senator's private account. Rumors grew. They always do in towns where the speed of gossip outpaces the speed of proof. Some said Douglas had been reckless, drunk, or irresponsible. Others whispered that he had crossed the wrong people with his pen. The Senator Martin Caldwell was a polished man with a philanthropic smile and a foundation that donated to local schools. He denied any involvement in Doug's death publicly and privately told aides that the accusations were the work of grieving minds. But rumors have an appetite for detail, and as details accumulated around invoices, sightings, and unexplained phone calls, the rumor's shadow grew long enough to darken Caldwell's image. For the sheriff's department, there was no smoking gun. They had a crash scene and a trajectory of a car. They had a coroner's report saying traumatic injuries consistent with blunt force from a collision. Communities expected quick answers, and they were given one. But the family and their investigator were not satisfied. They continued to prod, unearthing fragments of paper that connected the senator's inner circle to a stilted repair job at 3 a.m. Invitations to reopen the case were met with institutional inertia. The word conspiracy is heavy and smells like a novel. In rural towns, people preferred a neat tragedy to rotten complexity. But the truth tends to have more questions than citizens like. And Maria pushed until she was hoarse. Cold cases live in that tension between the desire to move on and the obligation to the truth. They collect dust in file cabinets, waiting for a breath of new evidence. For 8 long years, Doug's case collected dust, punctuated by small, persistent efforts by Maria and Tom, little successes that inspired renewed but short-lived attention. It wasn't until 1990, nearly a decade after the accident, that the case began its final movement from rumor to verdict. The spark was not a forensic miracle, but a man's confession, not the senator's, but one of the men who had driven the dark sedan that night. His name was Hector Morales, a small-time fixer who had slipped along the edges of political power for years. Hector had been paid, he said later, to make trouble go away. The weight of 8 years had worn on him. The cocktail of guilt, alcohol, and the fear of being tied to other crimes had finally broken him. He walked into a county station with a single request: to speak to someone who would listen. In that worn interview room, under fluorescent lights that hummed like an old refrigerator, he did. What he told them started the long, legal metamorphosis of a rumor into a court case. Hector's confession was messy with the human details that make stories real. He remembered the senator's voice over the phone, calm and economical, asking for discretion. He remembered meeting a second man, a driver named Russ, a man who knew how to drive like the road belonged to him. He remembered being handed a thick envelope and being told to follow a Chevy at night, to nudge it if the opportunity came. He remembered thinking the plan was just to scare, not to maim. On the highway, Russ brushed the Chevy's bumper. The fender clipped the rear driver's side, and the Chevy veered. Hector said he'd seen the tree through the windshield and felt his stomach drop. They drove away. After that, the senator's voice was a distance Hector wanted to forget. Confessions are powerful, but they need scaffolding. Prosecutors could not build a case on one unnamed memory. They needed corroboration. Hector provided details only someone involved could know. The type of cigarette Doug smoked, the pattern of a dent on the senator's car that matched a towing bill entry, the time of departure from a private club that placed the senator within a driving window that night. The investigators reopened the evidence. They found the black sedan's license fragment in Earl's earlier testimony matched a rental registry in a neighboring county. The towing invoice matched a repair shop, a faded stamp that had been ignored previously. Witnesses who had stayed silent out of fear now whispered to the authorities. A janitor who'd cleaned the senator's car upholstery at 2:30 a.m. because he'd been told, "This stays between us." Each new corroboration tightened the net. The legal team prepared for the worst and the best. The worst being an inability to convict a man who had power, money, and a public persona. The best being the chance to right a wrong. The arrest of Senator Martin Caldwell in 1990 was a hush that rippled across the state. It was cinematic in the way the police show up at a man's front door. But the quiet sting of it was more human than theatrical. Caldwell's jaw remained clenched when deputies took him in. He insisted on his innocence in front of cameras, denouncing the charges as political retribution and the result of a vendetta. Supporters rallied in the weeks that followed. Opponents rejoiced openly. The town of Omaha, the city where Douglas had filed his last story and where he had been beloved, felt as if it were split down the middle. The courtroom is a different kind of theater. It's small, crowded, and its narratives are strict. Prosecutors built their case on motive, admission, and pattern. They put Doug's final article on display, printed and worn at the edges, and argued its existence as motive, that the story threatened to reveal a senator's complicity in a previous, deadly hit-and-run. They used Hector's confession, but they bolstered it with layers: the towing invoice, the rental registry, the janitor's testimony, and a ledger entry that showed a payment from a numbered account tied to the senator's charity. Defense attorneys pointed to gaps. They argued the years had made memories malleable and confessions unreliable. They questioned Hector's character: small-time criminal, desperate, inconsistent. They called witnesses who said they saw Caldwell in a different place that night. The trial became a battle of plausible timelines. Eyewitness testimony is a fragile thing. Memory changes. It reconstructs with the telling. But some witnesses stood firm. Earl the farmhand revisited his initial statement, this time with the veteran investigator Tom at his side. And he added something he had feared to say years before. He'd seen a man in the back of the black sedan speaking into a little radio, the kind of device used by organized drivers. The janitor swore to cleaning an upholstery patch that matched the senator's car and described a man with a politician's gait ordering him to make it like nothing happened. The man he described fit a pattern. There were also witnesses who faltered. Some changed their testimony after pressure from defense lawyers and hints about consequences if they lied. The judge had to carefully navigate admonitions, hearsay warnings, instructions on reasonable doubt. In court, the senator's charisma met the evidence. He was eloquent and poised under cross-examination, a man used to being believed. But the picture prosecutors painted was insidious. A man who had used influence to shield himself from the consequences of a reckless history, then arranged to keep a reporter from publishing the truth. They did not paint him as a monster. They painted him as a pragmatic steward of his image. That was worse in many ways because it made his alleged actions seem calculated, adult, and painfully ordinary. The jury listened to a narrative braid of phone records, gas receipts, and a rhythm of timelines. The prosecution's job was to weave those threads into a cord strong enough to hang a verdict on. The confessions from co-conspirators were crucial. Hector's verbal admission was bolstered by Russ, the driver, who eventually agreed, under immunity terms, to testify. Russ was different from Hector. Pragmatic, colder, a man who took pride in his driving and who had always thought of himself as invisible on the road. Under oath, he described the night with an eerie calmness. The strategy, the nudging, the moment the Chevy spun. He said he had not meant to kill. He had meant to frighten. The law doesn't adjudicate meaning as much as consequence. Russ's testimony, together with Hector's, gave the jury the sequence of acts and the chain of command. They testified about money. Envelopes passed in alleyways, coded language and phone calls. The senator's aide who arranged logistics. The jury watched as a map of complicity unfolded, not with Hollywood spectacle, but with the tedious, devastating clarity that the legal system affords: acts, witnesses, documentation. In the gallery, Maria sat like a small island in a tide of emotion. She testified not about the crash, but about Doug, his work ethic, his devotion to truth, and the way his scoop had rattled a man used to being untouchable. The prosecutor used her testimony to humanize the victim, to remind the jurors that they were not only weighing evidence, but also answering for the life of a man who had been silenced. Doug's colleagues read extracts from his final reporting into the record. The newsroom's hum almost felt present in the room. The cadence of newsprint, the smell of coffee, the small daily sacrifices made in pursuit of truth. Rumors and lies that had circulated for years were methodically weeded out during the trial. Defense attorneys tried to stoke doubt by pointing to inconsistencies. Why had Hector waited 8 years? Why had Earl not been believed earlier? Why did the towing bill seem ambiguous? Each doubt was a stone turned over in the prosecutor's hands. The judge reiterated instructions about the weight of evidence and how memory works. Jurors, ordinary people plucked from workplaces and households and placed into the theater of justice, deliberated for hours. When the verdict came, it did what verdicts do. It ended one chapter and opened others. The jury found Caldwell guilty on several counts related to conspiracy to commit murder and obstruction of justice. There were cheers and tears, and there were stunned faces. In the immediate aftermath, the town of Omaha felt uneven. Some believed in the judicial system's correction. Others felt the judicial system had been weaponized. The senator's supporters called it travesty. Doug's friends felt vindicated. Yet the conviction did not erase the years of silence or the ache of Doug's family. For Maria, justice arrived with ambivalence. The law had paid attention at last, but it had taken 8 years. The conscience of men like Hector and the tenacity of a grieving sister. Courtroom dramas often leave scars and sparks in a community. In the months following the trial, more whispers became confessions. A senator's inner circle fractured. Aides who had been loyal started to distance themselves. Documents surfaced. Old friends who had tolerated the senator's moral flexibility started to feel ashamed. The senator appealed, and the case threaded through appellate courts. Each legal maneuver prolonged the agony, but the foundation of the prosecution's case was strong. A combination of witness testimony and the crumpled paper trail of payments and rides. The story did not end with a conviction. For one thing, the trial only answered certain legal questions. It did not explain motives in whole, nor could it ever return what had been lost. Doug's children had grown older, and they had to decide how to live with their father's absence. The newsroom reorganized, hiring a new investigative reporter who considered Doug's desk a kind of shrine. Maria found herself waking at night, thinking about the small things, his last joke, the ash-stained mug, the way he never called home when he was late. The town grappled with the knowledge that power could be used to manipulate truth. There were also quieter shifts. Local policies changed. The county tightened oversight on political donations and vehicle rentals that had been exploited to avoid detection. Journalists became more cautious, and the awareness of the thin line between accident and assassination sharpened. Community groups formed to protect whistleblowers. The sheriff's department instituted new protocols for reopening suspicious deaths. In unexpected ways, Doug's death changed the machinery that had once shielded those with influence. But truth's victory often comes with an unsettling aftertaste. Hector and Russ had testified under plea agreements. They had been spared the full force of the law in exchange for their truth. Some thought this compromise necessary. Others felt the deal was a corruption of justice. The senator's supporters argued the testimony was coerced. The families of the conspirators had to grapple with how to survive after their loved ones had traded their loyalty for leniency. The law had made choices. Society had to live with them. There were confessions that arrived after the conviction as well, small, messy human things. A campaign manager admitted to shredding an envelope. A former aide told a journalist in confidence about bizarre moments in the senator's office where money changed hands in plain sight. An aging mechanic finally unburdened described the smell of motor oil in a car that had been fixed in the dead of night. Each new fragment did not change the verdict, but deepened the picture of a man who had once thought himself above consequence. Yet not all secrets had been unearthed. At the end of the trial at midnight, Maria stood in Doug's old driveway and looked up at the sky. "They got him," she whispered to the darkness, meaning the senator. But did we get everything? The cold case solved in court did not mean the town had forgiven itself for the years of silence. It did not repair the small cruelties that had allowed a man to be disbelieved simply because he loved inconvenient truths. It did not fill the empty chair at family dinners. It only acknowledged that justice, while slow, could sometimes move. In the last scenes of the documentary-style telling, we return to the men whose confessions pulled the thread. Hector, in a prison interview years later, looked older than his years. He held his hands together and said the thing people seldom expect. That confession did not wash away his guilt. It loosened it maybe, but guilt is like a shadow that follows. Russ, who had spent a decade living in the margins, wrote letters to Doug's children that asked forgiveness without demanding it. He described the mechanics of a life that had been chosen for him by circumstance and pride and obligation. For Doug's daughters, those letters were not absolution, but a complicated companion to their grief. The community kept talking. Documentaries aired, podcasts replayed court transcripts late into the night, and newspaper columns asked after the culture that allowed silence. The senator served time, his name now a footnote in the history of the state's political scandals. Some of his supporters remained loyal, arguing that a public life should not be judged by private actions. Others said the story was proof that no one is untouchable. The truth, like water, finds its way through cracks, carrying sediment of shame and moments of courage. If there is a moral to this kind of story, it's not tidy. Sometimes it's that the work of one persistent family and a few disillusioned participants can redirect a river. Sometimes it's that power and money can buy a lot, but not everything. And sometimes it's that justice may come late, but its arrival can reconfigure a town's memory of itself. For Omaha, Doug's death and the senator's conviction were chapters in a messy book about who they were willing to believe and how they treated the people who asked questions. At the end, the camera lingers on a small, ordinary thing. The brick wall outside the former newsroom where someone had years ago painted Doug's name in black ink temporarily. A memorial scribble that became a small shrine. The people left pens and coffee cups near it. A quiet echo of the man who had written and who had been written out of his own life. A child walked by and traced the letters with a finger, asking a parent who he was. The parent told a version of the story, the version that had been simplified to spare a child the ugly parts, and the child nodded, eyes wide, asking how people could be so brave. The case that started as an alleged car accident had become a cause that remapped a community's conscience. The cold case solved had not returned Doug, but it returned a measure of truth to the public record. It forced institutions to examine themselves and, in some measure, to change. And yet, there was one last small mystery that lingered after the convictions, a question that fed the whispers and the documentaries and the late-night callers. In a locked filing drawer at a senator's aide's home, investigators found a single roll of undeveloped film, photographs taken the week before Doug's last article ran. The images were of the county road where the earlier accident had occurred, of a sedan driving past at odd hours, of a man at the edge of a field looking toward the county line. The images suggested there had been surveillance, someone watching, someone ensuring nothing leaked. Who had taken photos? For whom were they taken? The answers lay just out of reach. That unprocessed roll didn't change the conviction, but it pointed to a larger question. The possibility that someone higher or someone more organized had an interest in sculpting the truth. It hinted that the net might have been wider than investigators had time to unravel. The community, which had found one measure of closure, realized closure was partial. They had solved a cold case, but the cold file had more pages. The final shot pulls back from the brick tribute at the newsroom to a highway at twilight. A black sedan moves along the strip, ordinary and unremarkable. The narrator's voice, soft and steady, says, "The truth can be patient, and sometimes it waits years to be heard. This is how one voice, a reporter's, forced a town and a system to listen. The case is closed, but the story is not finished. There are names on paper that still need drying. There are envelopes that were never opened. Doug's story taught a city to pay attention, and as long as someone remembers, the work continues. In the weeks after the senator's conviction, an anonymous letter arrived at the newsroom. It contained a single detail, a name written in a tight, unfamiliar hand, and a date that preceded Doug's crash by 3 months. The name belonged to someone who had never been subpoenaed, someone who had moved away and whose whereabouts were unknown. The letter's writer promised to speak, but only if they could be guaranteed safety. The documentary camera cuts to black on those words. The final frame reads silently, like an unanswered summons. Who else knew? Who else had looked the other way? The cold case had been solved, but a harder truth, who benefited from that silence and why, remained to be told. Douglas Edwards had been gone for years when the anonymous letter arrived, simple, cut from typewriter. The kind of old-school desperation that fit the town's slow-moving rhythms. Maria recognized the slanted tightness of the handwriting on the back of the envelope. It matched nothing she could place, and that alone made every hair on her arms stand up. Inside was a single line, a name and a date. No plea, no flourish, only an instruction. Meet me, or don't expect answers. In the months after the senator's conviction, the newsroom that had been Doug's last refuge turned its attention to finishing his work. They had pulled the cold case solved into the light of print and television. But the anonymous letter promised something more. Not vindication, but an expansion of the story's frame. The letter's name belonged to a woman who had been whispered about during the trial only in private corners, someone Maria and Tom had tried and failed to locate. Evelyn Pierce, a logistics coordinator who had handled late-night movements and strange errands for the senator's campaign in the late 70s and early 80s. Evelyn had vanished after the trial, her trail deliberately thin. Now the letter said she wanted one thing, safety, and she would speak. The newsroom assembled like a small army of the anxious. A producer with a rolling camera, a lawyer who insisted the station keep everything documented and lawful, and Maria, who felt both the gravity of the moment and the bristling fear that whatever waited behind Evelyn's name might not be ready to be spoken. They drove out of Omaha toward a place Evelyn had been rumored to hide, an older community, a county over where people stayed to themselves and where a stranger could slide into anonymity. Evelyn's meeting place was a diner with a fluorescence that hummed and a coffee that tasted of old pennies. She arrived looking smaller than rumor suggested, hair cropped, eyes set by things that had aged a person far beyond the years on her passport. She asked to be recorded only on tape, then only after the lawyer had promised a sealed transcript. She spoke in phrases like ledger entries, naming meeting places, times, and coded words that had meant only one thing inside the senator's circle. Clean it, make sure, disappear the noise. Evelyn handed Maria an envelope. It was lighter than it should have been. Inside, on a tissue the color of old paper, rested a single roll of film and a tiny scrap of notepaper with a name and a date, an address. Evelyn's fingers trembled when she offered it, but she did not look away. You asked who knew, she said, voice low. You asked who watched. I kept memories so I wouldn't drown. I kept receipts. I kept the film. The roll, when the team took it to a lab that would develop it under chain of custody, felt like a relic from a different era. Raw, chemical. The thing that had waited decades to tell its small, stubborn truth. The station insisted on a controlled process. Detectives from the county came, not as prosecutors, but as witnesses to the development of an artifact. In a room that smelled of fixer fluid and bleach, the film bloomed into frames like a heartbeat brought into light. At first, the photographs were ordinary. A country road at dusk, a Chevy parked at the shoulder, the muddy impression of tires. Then the sequence changed in ways that made everyone in the room hold their breath. The next frame showed the Chevy's driver door open, a man bent over, hands on the wheel. Doug, unmistakable by the coffee-stained collar and the notebook one could see tucked into a jacket pocket. He looked disoriented, blinking toward a set of headlights. Then a low-slung van rolled into view. Figures moved in and out of the beam. Hands helped Doug out of the car. They were not helping him into an ambulance. They were placing him into the back of the van. One frame after another showed the van's sliding door closing. The outline of someone standing in the light. A man whose posture the room knew because they had seen him at countless county meetings. A man who had been Tom Hale's shadow and one of the neighborhood's familiar faces in the aftermath of the crash. The lab tech set down the photographs and didn't speak. The sound in the room became the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic. Tom Hale had been the one who put pieces together for Maria in the years after Doug's death. He had been her instrument of truth. He had filmed, he had found. He had coaxed reluctant witnesses into speech. For years, he had warned the exhausted nobility of the person who acts when institutions do not. To see him in the photographs at the scene, at the precise moment when Doug could still have been saved, felt like a betrayal delivered in slow motion. The photographs did not show him driving the van. They showed him standing too close, fingers on the frame, watching as the sliding door sealed shut. Later frames showed the van pulling away, headlights disappearing down the county road. The prosecutor who'd worked the Caldwell case sat ashen. "If this is authentic," she said, "we've been chasing the wrong theater." She called for immediate preservation of the new evidence. The station held the photos back from broadcast while the legal wheels started to turn. A small, almost stifled war over procedure began. Who would get custody of the photos? What protections could be guaranteed to Evelyn? Would the investigators reopen the case yet again? The public breathed in and out in the days following, wary, powered by a strange mixture of vindication and dread. Tom came into the newsroom the following morning as if he had slept poorly. He wore the same jacket he always wore and the same face that had weathered too many winters. He did not deny being in the photographs. He confessed to being at the scene, but his explanation tore at the edges of the town's belief. He said he'd been following a lead, that he had seen the Chevy on the shoulder after midnight and had stopped to check the scene, and that when the van arrived, he had been tricked. He had been told over the phone that he was part of a sting to catch someone dumping contraband. He swore he had tried to intervene. The film, he said, froze a moment taken out of context. The prosecutor looked at him like someone who had waited a long time for the right question. "Why didn't you report the van leaving, Tom?" He folded his hands. "Because I was afraid. Because I had a family who would be hurt. Because the men who called me that night had leverage. Because I thought if I did nothing, maybe I could help them later." It was a confession that read like a chapter in a book. Small compromises leading to monstrous silence. People in the newsroom felt the old anger return, the one that had driven Doug. It felt familiar and bitter and raw. Maria wanted to believe him, but the photos had already done their work. They had a narrative of complicity the town could not swallow easily. Tom's presence at that late hour made him more suspect than any politician. He was someone the public had trusted. That trust could feel like a blade. While the legal team argued procedure, the station quietly sent a copy of the developed frames to a retired lab analyst known for his careful eye. He noted anomalies and non-anomalies with equal care. The film grain matched the era, scratch patterns consistent with an old camera, and the chain of custody surrounding Evelyn's envelope was intact. There are also a few frames that had not been taken by the same camera, close-ups from a different lens, shots that had been hidden between frames like a message slipped into a book. Those frames revealed a small object inside the van, a manila envelope, the kind Doug once kept in his filing cabinet. A flap peeled back enough to show a printed name on a piece of paper. It was the signature of a law firm long associated with the senator's charitable arm. The more the team dug, the more inconvenient facts slipped into their hands. A tow ticket that had once been filed under miscellaneous now had a note attached in the senator's handwriting. A credit card transaction matched a late-night motel stay where a man listed as consultant had checked out under a different name. A bank slip revealed a cash withdrawal that would have placed a man near a rental agency at exactly the time the van could have been acquired. Each small paper was a radio tower broadcasting the same frequency. This was not a single, isolated act of malice, but a pattern of orchestration. With every new piece of evidence, the town slid closer to another trial. Prosecutors convened a new grand jury. The courthouse smelled of old varnish and cold coffee. People in Omaha flooded the sidewalks outside the building, carrying signs that demanded truth or closure or both. The public's appetite for finality was ravenous. In the days leading to the indictments, anonymity dissolved and people found their voices. Then, on a cool evening 2 weeks after the film development, a USB drive arrived at the newsroom wrapped in a brown paper bag. No return address. No fingerprint smears. Inside was a digital file labeled simply, "If I don't want me to tell it." They played it on a monitor in a room too small for the number of people who crowded into it. The voice on the file was Douglas's. There was no mistaking his cadence. The little rustle of the paper he often kept under his chin while speaking. He said nothing about gore or brutality. He spoke about systems, how privileges get turned into weapons, and how the machinery of influence can make people willing participants in things they would never have imagined. Then his voice read a list of names. One of the names was the name that cracked the newsroom into two halves. A judge, Judge Alistair Grady, mentioned not as a peripheral actor, but as someone who had helped approve the routes and made the calls quiet. No one outside a narrow circle had ever suspected a judge would be implicated. The name landed like a rock thrown into a placid pond, sending out a widening ring of fear and disbelief. The prosecutor staggered under the weight of the evidence. A sitting judge implicated by the voice of a dead man? The complaint was explosive and dangerous. Legal ethics screamed caution. The newsroom's attorney told Maria and the producer they had to handle the material with crystalline care. Verify, vet, corroborate. The public's hunger for revelation would have to wait, while process did its invisible work. But secrecy is a fragile dam. News leaked. Small local shows began to play the audio in bits and pieces, and social feeds churned with speculation. People called talk radio in droves. The town that had once preferred the tidy comfort of tragedy now found itself living inside a much larger unease. If a judge could be implicated, what line remained between law and power? On a Tuesday morning, the grand jury returned indictments, not only for obstruction and conspiracy related to Doug's death, but also for witness tampering. And in an unthinkable step, they sought to subpoena the judge. The legal world reeled. The judge denied the allegations in a terse statement, asserting that the naming was a fabrication from a desperate archive. Supporters called it a witch hunt. The courtroom that once had carried the senator's trial hummed with a different electricity. This one younger, sharper, more personal. Tom, who had been under examination and then released pending further inquiry, did not respond to the subpoenas. He went quiet. The day the judge's subpoena was issued, Tom took his truck and drove nowhere that anyone could track. He told Maria over a cracked phone line only that he was going to find the people who forced him to make a decision. And then the line went dead. His house remained, lighted by a porch bulb unmanned. A week became 2. Tom's service revolved from hope to dread. Then, as if to prove that old networks have a capacity for ugly theatrics, a package arrived at the front steps of the courthouse. The sheriff's deputies opened it carefully. Inside lay a single Polaroid, the kind of slow-developing instant memory that seemed almost deliberately archaic. The photograph showed the newsroom's brick wall where Doug's name had been painted. Only the image was different. Someone had taken a picture of the memorial at night, and the flash had caught in the reflection of a rain-slick window, a figure standing to the left. The figure's face was blurred, but the posture was unmistakable. Tom Hale's shoulder, his beard shadow. Attached to the Polaroid was a note in a hand that was not Tom's. Walked away or planted proof? The implication was immediate and poisonous. Did Tom flee because he felt guilt, or because someone wanted him to disappear so they could manipulate the narrative? The sheriff's office called for increased patrols, and the courthouse filled with plainclothes officers. People whispered on benches. The town felt like it had been folded and then unfolded wrong. The newsroom determined to run a full hour-long special, a methodical, documented walkthrough of the new evidence, the newly developed film. the audio tape, the tow bills, and the judge's alleged role. Maria would be there. She was no longer merely a sister. She had become the guardian of her brother's work. The person who refused to let the phrase "cold case solved" become a neat chapter rather than a living wound. Promises to air were made. Lawyers readied disclaimers. The special would be careful, deliberate, grounded in documentation. The night before the broadcast, someone tried to set fire to the station's satellite dish. The flames were small and contained, but the message was stark. Stop the transmission. That act, that almost symbolic attempt to choke a signal, changed the tone of the entire operation from expose to survival. The station did not cancel. They increased security. At 8 p.m. the following night, the auditorium where the station set up their cameras was full. Camera lights made halos in the air. People from Doug's old newsroom sat shoulder to shoulder with attorneys and activists and curious citizens. The on-air talent walked through the evidence with a measured cadence. The film, Tom's presence at the scene, Evelyn's testimony. The audio naming Judge Grady. They laid out, piece by piece, the architecture of a system of influence. Then, as the program neared its climax and the newsroom was about to play the most damning frame, a man in the back of the auditorium stood up. He was in his 70s, wearing a suit of a cut that suggested old money and careful tailoring. He walked down the aisle with a slow, deliberate gait, and the room went silent in the way rooms go silent when someone crosses a line of expectation. When he reached the front, he removed his hat and said, in a voice that carried and landed like a verdict, "My name is Harold Vaughn. I used to advise politicians. I used to be the quiet hand that arranged things people did not want to discuss in public. I have been named in those frames, and I do not deny standing where I stood." The auditorium felt as if a hole had been blown through it. He did something no one expected. He handed a sealed envelope to Maria and said, "You want truth? Here is what I kept for myself." The envelope contained a ledger, the kind of old-school accounting book that movies show when illustrating clandestine networks. It was meticulous and small and full of names and dates, not just local names, but addresses in Washington, phone numbers that belonged to offices with power. There were initials and shorthand notations, a map of patronage. At the bottom of one column, scrawled and underlined, was a phrase, Operation Quiet Roads. People felt a cold pass through them. Vaughn had admitted his presence at the fringes of influence for decades. He had now placed a crime inside a system with a design and a name. When a reporter asked why he had come forward, Vaughn smiled with an old man's dryness and said, "Old men get tired of being heroes. Sometimes they get tired of being criminals too." The ledger became the hinge on which everything swung. Prosecutors moved quickly, issuing subpoenas and seeking warrants. The judge, named in the audio, faced new scrutiny. The federal authorities took an interest. The town that had once been careful now buzzed with a new certainty. The conspiracy was not only homegrown, it fed outward like roots under pavement. And then the last twist fell, not through paper and voice, but through a camera. The footage that had been scheduled to play as the final block of the special. The developed film's final frame was cued. The audience leaned forward. The lights in the studio made the air thick. The producer clicked play. For a long time, the film showed only a blur of motion, the van pulling away, the road stretching empty. Then the last frame froze on something that no one in the room could have predicted, a clear, close shot of a watch. It lay atop a dashboard in the van, its face turned up. The watch was recognizable to anyone who had known Doug closely. It was the gold watch his father had given him. The watch Doug had worn every day for years. Beneath the watch, written on a scrap of paper, in handwriting the newsroom had seen 100 times in Doug's own notes, were two words, "Find me." It was a message from Doug himself. A stunned silence pressed like a physical weight. The implication was seismic and immediate. Doug had not been merely an unlucky witness to a crime. He had suspected that someone might try to vanish or reroute him. He had left evidence inside the van on purpose. He had anticipated in a lucid, fearless way that something might be done to prevent him from finishing his story. and he had left a breadcrumb that only those who loved him might follow. Minutes later, a detective ran into the studio, breathless. He handed Maria a small plastic bag. Inside it lay another Polaroid. This one of a garage door slightly ajar, and on the concrete beside it, a name stamped into the lid of a jewelry box, Hale. The timestamp on the Polaroid was the date of Tom's disappearance. The message was simple and devastating. Tom had not fled. He had been taken. The final act came like an earthquake after a tremor. The arrest warrants that had felt distant now slammed into the legal world. Vaughn was taken into custody for complicity. Judge Grady was placed on administrative leave pending an inquiry. A federal task force seized records. But the person the town had thought would explain everything, Tom, was missing. And the ledger Vaughn had handed Maria, once thought to be the map to the whole thing, had a final entry that made the blood run cold. The ledger named not only political operatives and donors, but also a handful of men with single-word titles scattered in the margins: cleaner, courier, anchor. The community that had gathered to exhale found itself inhaling a new, deeper fear. The agency that had been the moral backbone of the town, the sheriff's department, the courts, even the newspapers, now felt like a collection of vessels, some of them leaning, some of them hold. The line between law and leverage thinned like paper. Days later, as arrests mounted in quiet rooms far from Omaha Center, Maria received a phone call. The voice was unfamiliar, modulated, then cut to a whisper that felt like ice. "You held his name up like a flag," the voice said. "Now see what flags do. You have what you asked for. Be careful how you fly it." A week after that call, Tom's truck was found, parked at the edge of an old airstrip on the outskirts of town. Inside were personal effects: a notebook with pages dog-eared and full of scribbles, a lighter, a pen. There was no body. There was, taped under the driver's seat, a single recorded message on an old cassette titled "For Maria." The station played it with permission. Tom's voice was steady. He confessed in the clipped, honest way Tom had always used that he had been involved in cover-ups, not because of simple cowardice, but because he had been coerced. He spoke of debts, of threats, of a small boy he did not want harmed. He said that he had tried to make amends by keeping evidence safe and by planting the film where he thought it would surface only if he died. He said his disappearance was not his plan. It had been arranged. He begged forgiveness without the sanctimony of absolution. The cassette ended with a phrase that made every person who had known him feel a renewal of the old sorrow. "If you are looking for who pulled the string, look behind the stations that fed the strings. The man you trust to watch the watchers is the one who sold the screen." It was the kind of line that could be taken many ways. It implicated institutions, systems, and people. It implied that someone who had been promised to watch over justice had instead been the one feeding the mechanism. In the weeks that followed, indictments branched like a river delta. Arrests were made quietly in hotels, in private aircraft hangars, in suburban cul-de-sacs. Outcomes were uncertain and messy. Some men chose to plead. Others went silent. A few names on the ledger became the faces of the scandal. Others remained shadows. The town held its breath between the moments of accusation and the slow, grinding work of proving wrongdoing beyond a reasonable doubt. And yet, after all of this, the final, chilling revelation arrived not in court, but in a photo sheet found in an evidence locker that had never been cataloged. It was a transparency the size of one's palm, a negative that had been overlooked in the original 1982 crash file. When enhanced and flipped, it revealed an image that made the town shudder anew. The silhouette of a man standing on the courthouse steps the night before Doug's final article was to be published. He wore a coat that, in the enhanced frame, bore a lapel pin that was familiar not for its shape, but for its provenance. It was the pin of a federal judiciary event, a small, circular emblem some judges received when they sat for a particular conference. The man's face in the negative had been blurred by time and the vagaries of the chemistry, but the jawline and the angle of the ear were unmistakable to those who had watched the recent hearings closely. It was Judge Grady. The evidence had named him once before in an audio clip. Now the files tied him to the same place and time as the phone calls that had been traced to the van's rental. He had stood on the courthouse steps the night Doug's article had been set to run and had watched. He had not been merely a bystander to history. He had been present at its forming. The town felt as if it had been turned inside out and then pressed flat. People who had come to the courthouse to plead for transparency now wondered if there was any institution left to trust. They queued at the courthouse steps like mourners at a wake. In rooms behind closed doors, men and women who had sworn oaths began to speak. Faces stripped of the careful masks that had kept them respectable. And then, when the town thought it had been exhausted of shock, another photograph found its way into the public eye. It was a candid snapshot shot in a hurry. Doug at a diner, smiling in a way that was unmistakably his. Behind him, at the counter, a man stood with his back to the camera. He wore a jacket like the one a local newspaperman often wore. He had in his pocket a small badge, a badge that, when enhanced, showed the emblem of the sheriff's office. In the corner of the photo, almost missed, a phone number had been scrawled on a napkin and tucked into the frame. When the number was traced, it went not to a private line, but to a very particular extension inside the sheriff's department. The man whose jacket had been seen in the diner was not a stranger to the town. He was one of the deputies who had worked the original crash, the man who had written the initial report that concluded on road conditions and actions of the deceased. The deputy had since retired. His name was familiar to families in town. He had been the quiet professionalism at the scene. The community reeled once more, this time because the map of complicity had become so broad that it had to include the first people called to protect them. Friendships frayed. A man who had once been a neighbor was now a witness in a looming case. The town gathered in churches and bars and living rooms to debate what could be done. The final curtain fell not with a body or a confession, but with the silent removal of a man's badge from the public wall in the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a man who had once been a political ally of the senator, stood in front of cameras and said one sentence that felt like both apology and admission. We failed him. People in Omaha wept not because a man had been convicted, but because they had glimpsed the depth of how the machinery of influence had been used to corrode trust. The ledger, the film, the audio, all of it had conspired to do something else besides convict, to make the town look at itself and see the brittle architecture of its police and politics. And yet, after all indictments and hearings and the hush of courtrooms, after men were taken away in the dark, and after pages of a ledger were read into records, there remained a photograph that would not stop moving in people's minds. It was the last frame developed from a hidden roll, a small, grainy image of a child standing at the edge of a field, watching a sedan pass. The child's face was turned away, and on the back of the photograph, in a handwriting that matched Douglas's own, was a single sentence. They watched him, then they watched us. Beneath it, a new name had been written, a name that nobody in town recognized and that matched an address in a town 3 states away. The special that had pledged to answer questions ended with the image, and with Maria's voice asking its first and last question to the camera. Who else was watching? Who else kept quiet? How far does a ledger go? The camera pulled back, taking in faces filled with a mixture of exhaustion, defiance, and fear. In the days that followed, federal investigators sent subpoenas beyond the state lines listed on Vaughn's ledger. Journalists followed leads to places they had not expected. A warehouse in a neighboring capital, a name on a corporate file, an account with transfers to shell corporations and islands whose names felt like fables. Men in black suits began to move in ways that suggested power was being pried apart. And then the final blow, the one that left the town's throat sore and raw. The morning after they issued the first of those out-of-state subpoenas, a local bakery received an unmarked box. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, lay the small gold watch that had once belonged to Douglas's father. The watch that had turned up in the van the night of his disappearance and that had been entered in evidence years ago. Taped inside the box was a strip of Polaroids. Each one showed Maria at some ordinary moment, dropping a child at school, standing at a protest, crying at her brother's grave. They were recent and precise. Under the Polaroids was a single note in typewriter font. You wanted answers. You found them. Don't look too far. Maria felt in that moment the same old, honest fear she had felt the night her brother's car left the road. She stuffed the Polaroids into her coat and walked outside into a town that had changed and would never be the same. In the weeks that came, trials would begin and plea bargains would be made. Some men would be convicted. Some truths would be revealed. But one truth, simple and terrible, would remain. The ledger had been only part of a larger architecture. The people who had believed themselves untouchable had built networks that could bury stories by silence and move men like pieces on a board. The town of Omaha had called it a cold case solved and found. Instead, a cold file that had metastasized. On a late autumn evening, a broadcast aired a final piece, a montage of interviews with Doug's children, with Hector and Russ in muted frames, with Evelyn in a small kitchen where she had agreed to talk unsafely. The montage closed on Maria standing at Doug's brick wall, gently tracing the painted letters with one finger. She looked at the camera and said quietly, "I thought once the case was solved, we could breathe. We can't. We will keep breathing anyway." The camera lingered on her for a long time and then pulled back to the highway, the same stretch where the van had disappeared into a dark ribbon of trees. A car passed. Its taillights burned like a pair of slow coals. In the distance, beyond the highway and the town and the courts and the men with their ledgers, a light on a hill blinked, a single beacon, then another, then the slow, organized blinking of an array of lights on a facility whose gates the cameras could not cross. The narrator's voice returned, low and even, and it said simply, "We closed the file but not the map. Some names were named, some men punished, but others learned the lesson. Silence can be kept, and when silence is kept, it can be traded for power." The final image froze on that blinking array of lights. For the people who had believed they had watched a cold case solve, the pause was not relief, but the tightening of a knot. Behind the credits, there was one last photograph left on the editing table, a picture the producers had debated and then decided to cut. It was a photograph of a small, unmarked grave in a cemetery the town rarely visited. The stone had no name. On its base, just below the grass line, someone had scrawled a single word in the same hand that had written "Find me" on the scrap beneath the watch. Remember. The credits rolled. The audience stood and left in small clumps, talking in hushes that never quite became questions. The town settled back into itself, but with new shapes in its shadow, wider, stranger, and more mobile than before. Someone would keep digging. Someone would find another ledger. Someone might come forward. The legal wheels would keep grinding. And somewhere out past the highway where the road met the dark field, a van moved slowly along a service road, its taillights glinting like two small promises. That stories do not end when verdicts are read, and that people who were watched might still be watching. The town never returned to exactly who it was before Douglas's name was painted on that brick wall. What changed was less obvious than a headline and more structural, a slow rewiring of how people thought about authority, family, and the cost of silence. In the years after the cold case was finally pried open, the city, once comfortable with tidy explanations and polite deference, began to behave like a place that had learned a hard lesson about looking away. The courthouse, the newsroom, the sheriff's office. These institutions were the visible parts of the wound. But the real work of repair happened in kitchens, at kitchen tables in church basements, and at memorial picnics where people who had been on opposite sides of trials sat together and tried to listen. Extended families carried the story differently depending on where they sat in its web. For Doug's relatives, there was a complicated closure. Relief that his name had been cleared, grief that justice had taken so long, and an abiding weariness that no legal outcome could soothe. They learned to live beside the hole he left rather than to live through it, celebrating birthdays, making new jokes, telling the kinds of stories that keep a life present without making a wound. The senator's original supporters felt a mixture of betrayal and disbelief. Some never accepted the verdict and retreated into communities that insulated them from the facts. The families of those who cooperated with prosecutors, Hector, Russ, And even Evelyn navigated a different pain. Guilt and survival braided together. Their relatives had to reconcile the relief of protection under plea deals with the social stigma that followed their names for years. The investigators and journalists who had risked careers and reputations found themselves both lauded and critiqued. Some left the town, some stayed. And all of them found that the cost of truth had practical consequences for personal safety and for the trust in relationships they once assumed were stable. On a civic level, the city entered an era of reformation. There were audits and new transparency measures in local government, clearer protocols for reopening suspicious deaths and better protections, at least on paper, for whistleblowers. Media outlets that had once run breathless takes hurried to build public trust again by publishing sourcing practices and establishing hotlines for confidential tips. Local law schools and civic groups started clinics and watchdog initiatives, teaching ordinary citizens how to file complaints, demand records, and follow paper trails. Town meetings filled with people who had never attended before. They wanted to know how a single case could reveal so many seams in the civic fabric. That engagement, messy and sometimes bitter, became a kind of civic muscle building. Imperfect, necessary, and ongoing. Emotionally, the era was defined by a strange mix of fatigue and vigilance. Generations who remembered the old cover-ups grew quieter. Younger people, who had only known the fallout, grew more insistent. Conversations around kitchen tables shifted from what happened to what are we doing now. Therapists and community councils reported higher demand for counseling, not only from those directly affected, but from people who had absorbed the case as part of their communal identity. The town learned that solving case didn't erase the psychological damage. It taught them to treat trauma as something to be tended, not to be put away after verdict. The social fabric altered too. Friendships that had been assumed durable frayed when names turned up on ledgers. Political alliances dissolved. Churches and service organizations welcomed people who wanted to rebuild trust. Memorials to Douglas started to serve a dual purpose, honoring a life and reminding citizens to be skeptical when institutions speak in unison. Schools introduced modules about civic responsibility and ethical reporting. Local youth groups organized walks to remember victims of silence and to advocate for open records laws. The story became part of the town's curriculum for civic life, not a ghost in the closet, but a lesson in plain sight. For families still living with the ripple effects, the passage of years did not mean forgetting. It meant learning new rituals. Visits to the gravesite that were less about grief and more about commitment. Anniversaries where they gave to scholarships in Douglas's name. Dinners where they retold his good jokes as if practice could keep memory from crumbling. That steadiness, the small, ordinary things people did to honor the past while building a future, became the real scaffold of recovery. If there is a practical line to draw for the younger generation looking at this town's long arc, it is this. Civic responsibility is not an abstract virtue. It is a set of daily practices and small, sometimes lonely choices. Hold these few ideas close. Document. Keep notes and receipts. If something matters, write it down. Paper and time-stamped records turn rumor into evidence. Support trustworthy reporting. Good journalism is a community service. Learn how to evaluate sources. Donate when you can. And consider careers in fields that keep power honest. Use the tools available. Freedom of information laws, public records requests, and watchdog organizations exist for a reason. Learn how to use them. They are not only for lawyers. Protect whistleblowers. If someone comes forward with a credible tip, treat them with care and direct them to legal and organizational protections. Silence is cheap. Safety is not. Vote and stay involved. The people who make rules are elected or appointed by communities. Show up at meetings. Question policies. Don't outsource your civic duties. Tend to the human costs. Justice is not only legal, it is emotional. Seek help, build support networks, and demand mental health resources in schools and workplaces. Young people inherit a landscape reshaped by the mistakes and courage of those who came before. That inheritance includes the ledger and the photos, yes, but it also includes the small acts of repair. The scholarships, the new transparency rules, the quiet neighbors who stand watch. If they choose to step in to learn and to insist on accountability, they will be doing what Douglas hoped his work would spark: a town that listens, remembers, and refuses to make silence the easy choice. The last line of the ledger may have read, "Remember." But the living must do more than remember. They must act patiently and persistently, so that the next generation grows up in a place where questions are not punished and truth has fewer enemies. That is the work ahead, slow, unglamorous, and if done honestly, powerful enough to change a city's story for good. Before you go, make sure to hit subscribe and share, tap like, and turn on notifications, so you'll never miss the next Mystery Solved Cold Case videos. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening and watching.